And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Good afternoon. I'm National Weather Service Meteorologist John Cowen with your marine forecast. We'll start off taking a look at ice cover across our offshore areas. Most of the Beaufort Sea is now filled in with ice. A few areas of open water across the western Beaufort into the Chukchi Sea, but generally along the immediate coast, most areas seeing some thickening shore-fast ice. Taking a look at tonight's weather, we have a low pressure system moving in from Bristol Bay that'll be moving generally to the east over the next few days, bringing some very strong winds around the core of this low, very cold temperatures to the north of this low that'll be being pulled southeast over the next couple of days. Just generally unsettled weather across much of the eastern Bering into the northern Gulf. And as we get into Friday, we'll start to see conditions worsening across much of the Panhandle, some strong winds moving into that area as well. So generally into the weekend, the storm is going to be causing quite a few headaches across most of the southern half of the state. Getting into Saturday, again, those stronger winds, and you can see our isobars here are very close together, indicating some strong winds, especially through passes on Saturday. Some very strong northwest winds is what we're expecting coming through the passes into the offshore areas, as well as some snow and colder temperatures again pulling in to the southeast behind the front. Taking a look at our marine forecast for Friday, some very strong winds expected. Winds out of the southeast around 35, gusting 40, even 50 knots as we get up towards Juneau. Seas generally 5 to 10 feet in these inner areas. On the offshore areas, winds are generally going to be southerly around 35, gusting 45 knots, so very, very strong, and then turning easterly as we move north of Yakutat. Getting into Saturday, seas still pretty high in the offshore areas, 10 to 12 feet, but winds do back off to around 20 knots out of the southwest, and then southerly to southeasterly for Juneau down to Petersburg and Ketchikan. Seas still in that 5 to 10 foot range. Taking a look at South Central for our Friday marine forecast. Offshore winds will be fairly strong, however. It's looking at generally weaker winds across much of the Cook Inlet, Prince William Sound. I say weaker, still 20 to 30 knots, but relatively speaking. Seas generally 5 to 10 feet across much of the Cook Inlet, up to 7 feet across Prince William Sound, and then the offshore areas around 8 to 10 feet. But Saturday, again, with those stronger winds moving in, our low pressure system moves into the eastern Gulf, and behind it we have some very strong winds coming in from the northwest. So we do see some 50-knot winds across portions of the southern Cook Inlet, moving into the open Pacific, so seas 10 to 15 feet in this area. However, most other areas will remain relatively calm, about 10 to 20 knots out of the north for most areas. And then taking a look at Friday for our southwestern areas, again, most of the stronger winds will be offshore, in that 30 to 35 knot range, around 10 to 15 foot seas is what we're expecting there. And then coming over to the eastern Aleutians, 25 to 30 knots with seas generally around 10 to 12 feet on either side of the chain. For Saturday, again, those stronger winds will be coming mainly through the passes. The Pacific side, we will expect to see somewhat lighter winds, again with the sheltering from the terrain. However, the offshore areas will be looking about 5 to 8 foot seas on the Pacific side and up to 13 feet on the Bering side. And then coming west over to the central and western Aleutians, we see winds generally around 20 to 25 knots or so for Friday. Seas generally in the 5 to 10 foot range on the Bering side. On the Pacific side, a little stronger, upwards of 25 knots out of the west to northwest, and seas up to 15 feet. And then for Saturday, weakening very, very slightly to around 20 to 25 knots, and seas either side of the chain around 8 to 12 feet. Now taking a look at Friday's forecast for the west coast, we can see winds are generally out of the north, around 25 knots or so, seas in that 5 to 6 foot range. And then for Saturday, we expect a somewhat weakening trend, around 15 knots or so south of Nome, seas 4 to 7 feet in this area, still around 25 to 30 knots offshore of the YK Delta. And then looking farther north, again, most of these areas are already ice covered. However, for open sections of the Chukchi Sea, winds are generally going to be out of the east to northeast around 20 to 25 knots. And then as we go farther south towards the Bering Strait, winds out of the north-northeast around 25 knots, bringing seas up to around the 5 foot range. And then much the same for Saturday is what we're expecting, around 25 knots with seas about 5 to 7 feet for the Bering Strait. And that'll wrap up our marine forecast. I'm meteorologist John Cowen.